Welcome to the AltaSea webinar, one of a series of spectacular webinars that teach young people and people of all ages more about our oceans and the amazing people that are studying our oceans and doing as much as they can. We hope to sustain them and make them more sustainable. So AltaSea, first I should introduce myself. My name is Val Zavala, and I spent 30 years at KCET Public Television as a journalist and news executive. And I am now retired and loving it and very interested in the environment, which is one of the reasons why I hooked up with AltaSea. And I'm very, very pleased to be moderating these webinars. So AltaSea, if you don't know, is an enterprise. I'm going to read a little bit here. Located at the Port of Los Angeles, it is dedicated to accelerating scientific collaboration and advancing the blue economy, ocean economy, through business innovation and job creation. It also aims to inspire the next generation of ocean lovers who will help develop solutions to challenges such as climate change, energy supply, and global food security, all of which are very connected to and dependent upon a healthy and living ocean. Now, before we meet our panelists, let me encourage all of you to listen, to ask questions, and simply put your questions in the chat box. And then Jacob, who is moderating, or who is handling this behind the scenes, will text me your questions, and we will really try to get to as many of them as possible, because your questions are much more valuable than mine, because you are the ones that want to know and learn from these amazing women we have today. And they are, we will begin by introducing Laura Lilly. Laura Lilly is a 6-year PhD candidate in biological oceanography at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She researches how El Nino events impact the zooplankton community of California. Lilly is a seagoing oceanographer. She has gone on several month-long, maybe even multi-month-long sailing trips across the equatorial Pacific. Lilly is passionate about sustainability and conservation and has served for the past 4 years as the co-founder and co-leader of the Scripps Sustainability Group, which brings more sustainable practices to Scripps and UCSD. She believes strongly in getting young people excited about oceanography and has developed and taught short introductions to oceanography at several high schools around San Diego County. Welcome so much. Also with us, Sarah Maher. Sarah received a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Astronomy at the University of Victoria in Canada. She has a Master's in Geology and Geophysics from the University of Hawaii and Manao, and she has worked on plate tectonic reconstructions. She is currently a 6-year Earth Science PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Her research looks into using magnetic techniques to examine how the ocean crust cools. This involves month-long cruises off the coast of, included a month-long cruise off the coast of Easter Island, which is way off the coast of Chile. And there she collected magnetic and bathymetry, which is, I've learned that what that word means. It means the topography of the ocean floor, seafloor. So she collected data about the topography of the seafloor and rock samples. She also helped design a 10-day cruise to the Fieberling Seamont chain, which is about 500 miles off the coast of San Diego. She and her colleagues went on this cruise where graduate students learned geoscience methods at sea. Also with us as our third panelist, Camille Pagniello. Camille is a 6-year, they're all 6 years, so there are cohorts. 6-year PhD student majoring in applied ocean sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Camille thinks of herself as part marine biologist, part physicist, part engineer. Her research interests lie at the intersection of acoustics and geophysics, robotics, marine animals, and sustainable management. She is currently using passive acoustics, she'll explain what that is, and optical imaging to identify the sounds of certain fish species and to locate their spawning areas. She spent over 80 days at sea, including time as chief scientist of the kelp acoustics propagation experiment, an experiment where she designed as a graduate student. Her goal is to advance the understanding of ocean processes and further conservation efforts. So those are our amazing panelists, and I know you'll have a lot of questions for them, but I will start off our conversation. And we'll just start, I'll just kind of go sort of clockwise. I'll start with Sarah. Tell us a little bit more about your research. I just mentioned it so briefly, but if you can give us a little better, each of you actually will go around, give us a little better idea of what you actually do and how you hope, what you hope the results will be and how that will advance oceanography and hopefully the ocean sustainability. We'll begin with Sarah and then go to Camille and Laura. Sarah?
Yeah. Sorry, let me know if there's feedback or anything. Yeah, I use magnetic techniques to kind of look at how the ocean floor cools, which I think is really interesting. One of the things that really interested me about the ocean floor in general is that plate tectonic reconstructions are such a really recent scientific endeavor that it's only 50 years old. We didn't know how the Earth was forming and how plates are moving apart, and magnetics was a huge thing that really let us know how our Earth works in a lot of ways. So I was really interested in that, and I actually came on board at Scripps for this really cool project that lets us look at how the ocean floor cools. And the way we did that was we looked at this giant, I guess you'd almost call it a hole in the ocean floor. It's a rift that happened, and it exposed these really deep rocks. And we got to go and take these kind of machines here where we're looking at these really deep exposures in ocean crust. And we get the chance to actually take these rocks from the bottom of the seafloor and look at how they're oriented in space. And
you mean you bring them up to the boat?
Yeah, so what you can see behind us is there's this tool that's actually measuring the strike and dip, basically how a rock is oriented in space. And so we know how it's oriented, and once we grab the rock, we can take it and orient it back.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and so we're looking at the magnetic field. So I think everybody knows we have an Earth's magnetic field.
Yep.
It points north right now, but it actually has flipped over time. So while it's north now, it was south in the past. And that's actually
way in the past, right?
Yeah, well, it depends. It actually flips pretty infrequently, and it tells us how, like every 10,000 years or so, it tells us how, it gives us an estimate of the age of the seafloor. And we can use that to kind of tell where we are in time and reconstruct what's going on. So by grabbing a rock and knowing how it's oriented, we can look at the magnetic minerals in it. And if they're all pointed north, we know it's a certain time. And if it's pointed south, we know it's a different time than that. So we're actually looking at really interesting kind of rocks. Before we went here, we had less of this kind of rock than we had moon rocks. And now we have over 2 tons of rocks for me to look at and investigate. So it's been a really cool endeavor, and I just think it's really interesting. It's kind of the forefront of science. Is we know a lot about the ocean, but there's still so many mysteries. We don't know how things are forming in the very bottom of the ocean floor. So I think it's really cool to kind of look at how that's unfolding.
Wow. Phenomenal what we can tell from rocks.
Yeah.
Camille, elaborate on your research and how you think it'll impact our knowledge and sustainability of the ocean.
Yeah, while Sarah is studying the very deep parts of the ocean, I'm right at the coast. I've been working in the kelp forest right off the coast of San Diego here. That's what's pictured in my background. And along the coast, there's been about 50 marine protected areas established in Southern California to try and ensure the persistence and resiliency of these really diverse ecosystems. But these MPAs are on a scale of kilometers in size. So how do we monitor them? Marine protected areas are areas where there's no fishing allowed. There's no one's allowed to take the resources out of that area. And if we're gonna put those restrictions there, we better know that they're working to help preserve this habitat. So right now, the primary method of doing that is scuba diving surveys, where people get in the water and they swim around and they count the number of fish and look at what's there and report back. But if you've noticed the weather lately, scuba diving is not exactly possible all times of year, right? You need good weather, you need really talented people to do this because you have to ID things in real time. And the biggest thing is fish are actually scared of us underwater. They change their behavior when we're there. And so if we're trying to monitor these areas, we should try to do it non-invasively because that's kind of the point of establishing protections. But what's fascinating about all these animals underwater is a lot of them use sound. A lot of them produce sound. It's not just the dolphins and whales that produce sound, but it's the fish, it's the invertebrates. They actually produce sound not only to communicate, but sometimes it's as a byproduct of swimming or feeding. And if we can identify who is producing which sound, all we have to do is sit down there and listen, and we know who's in the environment at all times. An acoustic recorder can sit on the bottom for years and just listen and tell you who has been coming through this area. But before we get to being able to just listen, we need to answer that question of who. And that's what I've been trying to tackle with my research. I built an underwater camera system and paired it with an underwater acoustic system so that when I listen and hear the fish, I can triangulate where that sound is coming from. And if I know where that sound is coming from and it's in front of the camera, I can now say that this fish made this sound. And we can start building up this library of fish sounds so that one day in these marine protected areas, we can just put down acoustics and listen and know which species are there and how many are there of those individuals. So it's a really interesting technique that it's a promising method, and there's a lot of challenges. You can imagine trying to figure out where something is originating from underwater is very difficult. Sound underwater travels much further than sound does in air. And so you can hear stuff from kilometers away. For example, in the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest parts in the oceans, we can hear sounds from the surface, and we can hear sounds from miles and miles away. So in our coastal environments, you hear the small boats passing by. So when you're going to fish out on the coast, the fish can hear that going by. They can hear their neighbors. They can hear their predators approaching. They can hear their prey. And so using that kind of soundscape to understand more about our ocean is a really promising method to non-invasively monitor it.
Wow. You explained that so well. I understood the whole thing. That's the real key to success. Laura, tell us more about your research and how you hope it will impact the future of our ocean.
Oh, now I have to follow Camille's great example.
She really did great.
Well, thank you, Val. And as you alluded to already, Val, I study zooplankton off California. So you probably everyone's heard something about plankton. Maybe you've seen SpongeBob and Copepod. He's a little plankton. And so I'm looking at the whole zooplankton community, the little animal, tiny organisms that drift around. And I'm looking at how that community changes off California during El Nino events. So if you're from California, or if you've paid any attention to the news in the last 20 years, you've probably heard something about El Nino. And you might think heavy rains and maybe big waves, but El Nino has significant impacts on the ocean and the communities in the ocean. And the most important thing to know about El Nino is that we're realizing that not every El Nino event is the same, and that different El Nino events can cause different changes to the ocean environment. So some of them bring really warm waters, some only bring somewhat warm waters, some of them change the ocean currents in one direction, and some will cause anomalous currents from another direction. And so we have this kind of variability between different events, and I call that natural experimentation that El Nino provides us, because we ourselves cannot induce experiments in the ocean. It's a little too big for that. So I use this El Nino variability to look at how the zooplankton community changes. And I'm really trying to understand how different parts of the zooplankton react during El Nino events, and kind of what specific parts of El Nino are causing those changes, so that we can make future predictions. And you might think, okay, maybe I've heard of zooplankton, but I don't really care about them. But you should. And the reason why is that everything else in the ocean depends on zooplankton. So you've probably heard that blue whales, the biggest animals in the world, eat exclusively krill, the tiny little shrimp-like crustaceans. But blue whales aren't the only ones. Many species of whales eat them, seabirds eat them, forage fishes, so like sardines and anchovies, and then everything else eats those. So really everything above zooplankton depends on zooplankton. And the other most important thing about my research is that not all zooplankton are equal, and some are more nutritious, some are favorable prey, and others are not so good. So during El Nino events, you might have this big change in the zooplankton community, and the whales might not be so happy, or they'll go feed in a different direction or a different place. And then you start to have problems with ship traffic running into whales because the whales are suddenly in a new place, or crab fishermen are setting their crab pots, but the whales are trying to eat there and getting all entangled. So changes in whale and seabird foraging and in the fisheries that we depend on can start to interact negatively with our human behavior. So if we understand the zooplankton and how they're changing, then we can better predict how these higher trophic levels, these whales and seabirds, might change during El Nino, and then we can modify our behaviors and kind of get humans out of the way where necessary. And as Val mentioned, oh yeah.
Do you need to wait for an El Nino event, or can your research progress without having a Nino event currently in effect?
This is a great question. So we want to study zooplankton during El Nino, but we want to compare them to non-El Nino years. And what my research depends on is this 70-year time series, a very long time series of zooplankton data off California. And it's run by a program called the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations. It was started in around 1950. And they go out to sea, let's see, on boats like this. This is the Sally Ride. And so this program goes out to sea several times a year, and they use plankton nets to sample zooplankton, and they measure the physical properties of the water. So I can draw upon that time series and examine.
So there's always work to do. It's not like suddenly that you have to wait for El Nino to come, going to progress and to advance the research. That's great.
That's right.
Sarah, tell us a little bit, what was one of the more exciting days? Because all of you have been at sea, right? And I think sometimes together, is that right? You've all been on one cruise. So tell us a little bit, about the, perhaps, like, what is it really like to be out on a boat? And I'm sure it's totally different than when you're in the lab. And was there a memorable moment, a day, a dangerous, exciting, some special time that you really remember?
Yeah, I guess there's two different things, because a regular day probably isn't your most exciting day. I actually, before I came here, I've never really been an ocean person, in the sense that I didn't see the ocean until I was 18. I'm kind of different.
What? Where are you from?
I'm from Idaho originally, and I think similar kind of experience.
No, Idaho.
But yeah, so I came here and I knew I was going to go to sea for 35 days, but I didn't even know if I got boat sick or not. So it's seasick. So I took a lot of medications, and it's a really cool experience. They'll fly you to wherever the boat is. And in my case, it was Easter Island. So I got to go spend a few days on Easter Island, and then they take you out on a smaller boat to a bigger boat, and you end up in this bunk bed room where you're sharing with 2 to 4 other people. You're on these weird shifts. I did midnight to 4 a.m. every day and 12 to 4 p.m. every day. So I would be up till 4 a.m. I'd go to sleep, and then I'd wake up and everybody would already be up eating lunch, and that's my breakfast. And so you just do, and it's 24/7. You just do there's these machines running constantly behind you. So they have screens everywhere. You can see what's happening under the water. At the same time, I'm trying to process magnetic data and bathymetric data, so we know where we want to put this machine next. It was just 24/7 operation. So it was really an interesting thing. But I do want to say my best experience was probably on the cruise that Camille was on. We were dredging. So you don't get to have all these machines and see. You're essentially taking a big metal basket and dragging it across the bottom of the ocean and hope you grab some rocks when you pick it back up. And so we were dredging, and a couple people had said, we drove this whole way. We're 500 miles off the coast, and we're probably just not going to get any rocks or anything. So the 2 other chief scientists, Carrie McIntosh and I, were on board, and we had talked about what would happen if we didn't get anything. And it was 4 a.m. The dredge is coming up, and the first thing that shows up is the dredge is completely full with 100 pounds of rocks. And Carrie and I hugged each other. I might have teared up a little bit. And somebody turned to me and said, "Nice job, chief scientist." And I think that was probably, the pinnacle of my research career there.
Who would ever have thought a basket of rocks would make you cry?
You get excited.